So welcome everyone to the first MCR seminar of the term. Today we have Dave Holmes in the chemistry department talking about renewable energy sources.
Yep. Thank you very much. Mighty kind of you. Welcome, guys. As I said, I'm going to talk about a very specific form of renewable energy, namely solar fuels, where we take sunlight and make some sort of chemical fuel out of it. That's the general idea. Okay, so the motivation behind what we do is because we have sort of this energy problem. As you guys know, most of our energy today, most of our electricity comes from sources such as these fossil fuel fired power plants, exactly. And there's a recent report revealed by the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's giving strong support to the idea that climate change that's occurring today is caused by the greenhouse gases released from these fossil fuel power sources. So you can see within some certainty, the major cause of the increase in the observed warming that we're seeing in climate change is from the greenhouse gases, as you can see there. And so the quote directly from the report is that it's extremely likely that more than half of the observed increase in the global average temperature is actually due to human anthropogenic sources of greenhouse gases being released. And as you can see from this report from 2010, the largest source of the greenhouse gases being released is the energy sector, namely the electricity that's generated from fossil fuels. And so we want to move to an energy source that is carbon neutral and also ideally renewable in the long term. And so in my mind, the most natural place to look is the sun and solar energy. And so I just put up a little comparison for you guys. So 1 solar hour, that's the amount of energy that impacts the Earth's surface in 1 hour, is given by this amount here, which is a really large number, but just focus on the value there. And I want to compare that to the annual human energy consumption. So that is all the energy that we use as a species each year. So how do you think that comparison is going to stack up? I guess you would expect this to severely outweigh the amount of solar energy. But it turns out that they're almost identically equal, at least in 2001 when this fact was first published. The amount of energy that we receive from the sun in 1 hour could power civilization for the entire year if we could find some way to harness that energy. Of course, our energy consumption has increased since 2001, but the idea is the same, that if we could just harvest 1/9,000th of the energy that comes from the sun, we could power our civilization. And so I'm here to talk to you about solar fuels, which are sort of a chemical solution to the solar energy problem. And I say solar energy problem because, as you can see here, and as we all know, the sun isn't always shining everywhere on the globe simultaneously, right? So we need to find some way to store energy and also transport energy to places that might not get as much solar insolation. And so one solution are solar fuels. The basic idea is that we can use sunlight and water, combine them in such a way that we make a usable human source of energy, a chemical fuel that can be used however we need to. And also, as I mentioned, it can be transportable to places where it's needed most. So the first reaction, the first bit of chemistry that's important here is the water splitting reaction. And this is how we actually store the energy from the sun in most solar fuels technologies. We take 2 water molecules, and through a series of reactions, we create 2 hydrogen gas molecules and an oxygen gas molecule. In this case, our chemical fuel is the hydrogen gas, because we can run it through a hydrogen fuel cell, which just runs the reverse reaction of this. So it takes hydrogen gas and oxygen gas and then converts to water, releasing the energy that you stored. So essentially, the water splitting reaction would store the energy, and hydrogen fuel cells would allow us to then use the energy on demand. Bless you. A further solar fuel reaction that you should be thinking about is actually using the carbon dioxide, that same greenhouse gas that is a major component of the climate change issue that we see. And using the hydrogen gas that we produce from water splitting, we can actually do CO2 reduction, producing other carbon-based fuels, like in this case methanol, that can then be transported and again used in fuel cells, or a lot of carbon-based fuels can just be burned as liquid fuels that we kind of comprehend already. Alright, so I need to step in and explain a bit of the science behind how we make this work. One approach to the problem is to just use photochemistry. And so the basic idea behind photochemistry is you have a light absorber that actually captures the solar energy. You have some electron mediator that passes those electrons absorbed by the light absorber to some sort of catalyst that actually conducts the reaction that you want to have happen. And so one light absorber that is commonly used in our group and in other groups is a ruthenium-based dye that is well studied for its ability to absorb light photons and convert them into usable electrons. Often the electron mediator is a titania nanoparticle, so you would affix your dye to a nanoparticle surface, and the nanoparticle would allow the electron to be transferred to some sort of proton reduction catalyst, we like to call it. And this is the reaction. It's called proton reduction because in order to produce hydrogen gas, you usually have to take two protons and combine them into your hydrogen gas, your dihydrogen. So how this works is you have your solar input or your sun input as light. One photon excites an electron that's shuttled through your dye, through the mediator, into your catalyst. And then in the presence of an acidic solution, those electrons can be used to form hydrogen gas. It's the basic idea behind photochemistry. Now, you probably saw my talk was titled Photoelectrochemistry. So that's a bit of the photochemistry side. Now, the electrochemistry is a very specific type of science where it usually takes place in some sort of solution. So imagine this is a beaker filled with water and some electrolyte in the water. In electrochemistry, you have an anode where your oxidation reactions take place, and a cathode where your reduction reactions take place. And you have some sort of power source that inspires the reactions to happen. You apply a potential across the two electrodes in order to actually make the chemistry happen. We speak of electrochemistry in terms of half reactions. So I mentioned that at the anode, oxidation occurs. So the half reaction for the full water splitting reaction that occurs at the anode is water oxidation. So this is where we take our water molecules and convert them into the protons that we'll then need to use in order to form hydrogen gas. And I show this potential here because there's a certain amount of energy that you have to apply in order to get a reaction to occur in electrochemistry. And we compare those values using chemical potentials, or electrode potentials in this case. And so just keep that number in mind for a bit later on. 1.23 volts is a really important figure in solar fuels. At the other electrode, we have reduction occurring. So we're taking the hydrogen protons that we produce through water oxidation, and we're combining them with the electrons that we've passed around the circuit from one electrode to the other to produce hydrogen molecules. And the formal electrode potential for that reaction is 0 volts on a comparison scale. But the key number is that between these two reactions, you have a difference of 1.23 volts that you have to apply in order to get the reaction to occur at both the anode and the cathode. And so we apply our voltage, and we see that electrons flow from the anode to the cathode as the electrons are shuttled from the water molecules through the circuit, and then they reduce the protons that were made over here in the water oxidation reaction. You might have noticed that there are little oxygen and hydrogen bubbles coming off, because the idea is that if you get enough of the reaction to occur, you'll actually see these two gases separately bubbling out of your solution. And those are your fuels. That's where you make it. Alright, so let's combine the two now. We did photochemistry, did electrochemistry, and so we'll talk about photoelectrochemistry next. which is what my project is focused on. In this case, we sub out one of the metal electrodes, which could have been just platinum or some other conducting metal, and we actually put in a photoanode, which means it's an electrode that actually absorbs the light and catalyzes the reaction all at the same time. And usually we work with semiconductor materials that are able to absorb light. So the only difference here is that in photoelectrochemistry we need a light source in order to cause the reaction to occur. And you might notice that the power source is missing. It's because we're using the sun as our power source. We don't need a battery, or we don't need the mains in order to power the reaction. Ooh, back that up a sec. So every time a photon impinges upon your photoelectrode, it excites an electron. It excites an electron that is received from the water oxidation reaction, and then it follows around the same circuit just as in electrochemistry, except now the energy came from the sun or some light source rather than the energy or the battery. In some cases, where you can't receive enough energy from the sun, our material isn't good enough to do the full reaction all on its own. So in some cases, we started these reactions with an energy source as well, to sort of balance out the energy that we haven't gotten from our light source. And then in this case, you saw that there's just one photoactive, one light absorbing material on the photoanode side of things. There's also what we call tandem photoelectrochemistry, where you actually use two light absorbers for your two electrodes. So here, this was on the left side of the last image. This is your anode that's absorbing light that's coming in through some transparent window at the front side of our reactor. And then you also have a light absorbing cathode that is catalyzing reactions and absorbing light at the back side of the reactor. This is an approach that a lot of people like because all of the light that isn't energetic enough, all the light that isn't energetic enough to be absorbed by the first light absorber there passes through to the second light absorber, and you're using more of the solar spectrum. That way you're not wasting as much as the light that gets through your sample. And I like this image as well because it shows not just water splitting, but also the fact that we can bubble CO2 through the solution, and then at the cathode we can do some sort of carbon dioxide reduction to produce those carbon-based fuels that we like and are more familiar with, as opposed to just the hydrogen gas as fuel. And I included simulated solar light there because in our studies we don't use the actual sun. We have a machine, a light source that imitates the exact spectrum that we receive at the Earth's surface, so that we can study how our materials would perform if they were in full light. All right, so I mentioned that most of our light absorbing materials and catalytic materials are semiconductors. And on the photoanode side, I'm going to focus on one particular semiconductor that I work with, and it's called bismuth vanadate. It's actually a natural pigment that's used in paints and all sorts of things, as called bismuth yellow. You can see the color there reveals that. And this diagram here, I'm going to have to take a second to explain. It's showing the band gap of the material. And the reason that semiconductors can absorb light energy is because they have what we call a band gap. It's the difference between the energy levels of essentially the orbitals of the material. Hopefully we have some people have heard of orbitals in their chemistry studies throughout their lives. So you can think of as the lowest unoccupied orbital is one way to think of the valence band of the material. The highest occupied orbital is the way to think of the valence band. And then the conduction band is kind of like the lowest unoccupied place for the electrons to be. So your electrons are resting here in the valence band. And when you impinge light upon the sample, the electrons can move from the valence band here up to the conduction band of the material and actually move and do useful work at that point. And I list this band gap energy here because there's a certain set physical property of the material where the light impinging upon the sample has to have more energy than the band gap of the material in order to excite that reaction, that transfer of electron from the valence band to the conduction band. And so this value here, the bigger it is, the more you're limiting the amount of the solar spectrum you can use, because only a certain part of the solar spectrum will be able to induce those electrons to move from the valence band to the conduction band. Hope that makes some sense. Photocathode material that's receiving a lot of studies these days is called Cuprous oxide, another well-colored compound, which means that it's photoactive again, so that's always a good sign. And you can see that the band gap there is slightly smaller for cuprous oxide, meaning that it can absorb more of the solar spectrum. It can make better use of the light that's hitting it because more of the photons will have enough energy to excite an electron from the valence band to the conduction band and then flow through the circuit and do meaningful work. And so here's kind of a schematic of what that cuprous oxide electrode actually looks like when we prepare it. First we have essentially a glass slide that's been coated with a transparent conductor. In this case it's FTO, fluorine doped tin oxide. And we want that transparent conductor because we need to be able to allow the light that isn't absorbed by our material to flow through in order to impinge upon the other electrode or do other useful work. So we really need this transparent conductor that can pull in the electrodes but doesn't pull in the electrons but doesn't block any light. And then the gold's just there as a conducting layer to ensure good contact between the conducting surface. And then we have our semiconductor, the cuprous oxide there, that's actually absorbing the light. And in this case, they've deposited layers on top of the semiconductor, catalyst layers mostly, in order to actually excite the reaction to happen and make the reaction more feasible. So here's a nice scanning electron microscope image of what this material looks like on the nanoscale. You can see that they're really ordered materials, even down to the nanometer scale. Okay. So these are the way that we present a lot of the results in photoelectrochemistry. This is called a linear sweep voltammogram, and this is linear sweep voltammetry. So do you remember back to the photoelectrochemistry slide where sometimes we had to use a battery even though we were absorbing light because we just weren't getting enough energy from our light absorber? And so in this case, we're actually applying a bias. We're applying chemical energy or electrical energy from our power source and seeing how that changes the amount of electrons that we're actually harvesting from sunlight. So this axis here is the current that we're getting through our circuit. And in this case, it's negative because of the way the signs work out in the convention. But a larger bar means we got more current going through the circuit and more energy that could be stored. And I like these graphs because they're very pictorial in that we do light chopping. So you see the part of the graph where every 5 seconds or so they have sort of this gap where it goes back to 0. That's because they block the light for 5 seconds. And then when they take the blocking material away and let the light shine back onto your material, you immediately see the current increase. So you know that the energy you're getting is all coming from the sunlight or the simulated sunlight. So I think it's really a nice way of representing that all of your energy is actually coming from the light itself. And a key thing I wanted to show you here is that this material, which was not ours, was just published by another group, is achieving about 7 milliamps per centimeter squared. We present our data in terms of area because we think that that's the amount of energy you get from the sun is based on the area that you cover. So we present all of our results in terms of area. So 7 milliamps per centimeter squared is about a 9% efficiency. If you were able to convert all of those electrons, those 7 milliamps of current passing through into hydrogen fuel, it would be about a 9% efficiency. This is the material that I work on, bismuth vanadate, and again, we use that transparent conducting FTO layer in order to establish an electrical connection to our semiconductor material and also not block the light that's going through it. And this is a nice photograph, so you can actually see that this is what it would look like if you had it in your hand. Another set of SEM images just showing that there's nanostructure to these materials that actually help induce the various reactions to occur, because you have all of these sites at which the water oxidation reaction can occur. So the morphology or the shape that it takes on at the nanoscale is actually very important for the results that you get. This is another way of presenting results in the field of solar fuels. This is actually showing you the amount of hydrogen and oxygen that are being produced as a function of time. And they actually have to separately trap the two gases and quantify how much of each they have. But this is nice because we're not just relying upon the currents that we see to show us how much energy we're storing. We know exactly how much energy we're storing by how many hydrogen molecules we formed, right? So this gives you direct evidence that you are storing your energy as solar fuels. And there's good agreement between, in this case, there's good agreement between the amount of oxygen they expected to produce based on the current, and also the white circles are the amount of oxygen they actually measured in the system. However, the efficiency, while actually quite good for the field, is still really, really modest, 1.72% efficiency. But this is actual efficiency. This is the amount of energy that we've stored from the sun. We've stored 1.72% of the amount of energy that impinged upon the photoelectric material. So it's great that we can actually quantify that. Okay, I'm just going to talk about efficiencies in sort of a broader context. I mentioned to you that the solar energy spectrum hitting the Earth is something that we try to mimic in our laboratories. We use that same spectrum to simulate how our materials would work under the sun. That spectrum is represented here by the black trace. So you can see that at various wavelengths of light, which we all understand, there's a different amount or a different intensity of light, a different amount of energy being carried by the solar spectrum to the Earth for each wavelength. And the wavelength relates directly to the amount of energy that each photon has in it, right? And so for our materials, there's a certain wavelength beyond which our materials are, there's a certain wavelength beyond which the photons don't have enough energy to excite that electron transfer through our material. So you need to take a comparison of the solar spectrum and the band gap of your material to see how much of the solar spectrum you're actually using and actually capturing to make these solar fuels. And the red trace here is kind of showing you that as the band gap of your material moves to a lower energy or a longer wavelength, you're able to theoretically achieve a higher efficiency with material. So we want to narrow that band gap as much as we can, but we have to stay above that 1.23 volt boundary that I referred to you before, because of a certain set amount of energy that we have to have in order to induce the water splitting reaction. So you can see that the theoretical efficiencies that we're limited at are quite reasonable, actually, up to between 30 and 35% if we have the perfect material that had 100% energy conversion. But here are the actual achieved experimental efficiencies. And this is actually a logarithmic scale here, so you can see that most things are actually down, most achieved figures are actually down below the 1% efficiency value. The type of materials that I work with would fall mostly on this pink or red line here. And you can see that there's still a long way to go as far as the photoelectrochemical energy conversion to solar fuels. One technique that people use is to couple these photoelectrochemical technologies with photovoltaics, which just converts sunlight directly into electricity. And you can use you can use your photovoltaic as that battery that I put in the images earlier. You can use it to sort of give you that extra potential kick that you need in your system in order to achieve higher efficiency. So that's one approach that people are taking. All right, so now we're going to move on briefly to my project and what that actually entails. So here's sort of a crude photoelectrochemical reactor that we actually use in our group's lab. So we have the light coming through a transparent window here, entering through and then passing to some sort of photoelectrode that's suspended in solution there and hooked up to the circuit, as you can see externally. We also have a proton exchange membrane because we need something to separate the oxygen gas that's produced in this compartment from the hydrogen gas that's theoretically produced in this compartment here. So we have a membrane that separates the gases but allows the protons to flow through it in order for the full reaction, the full cycle to be completed. And then at the back you have a counter electrode, which could also be a light absorber in the ideal sense. So this is sort of what we work on at our lab scale, but my project is to take us from what this looks like and to move it towards something that we could actually start thinking about as a commercial grade reactor, commercial scale reactor. And so I started a little bit of research into the field, and people are sort of working on technologies or systems that are much like ours. They're really small scale. Penn State, there's a tiny photochemical reactor that looks like this. The Gretsler group really leads the field. They're in Switzerland, and they work with reactors that look like this. They're a slightly larger scale, but still not the sort of commercial scale rigor that we wanted. So I stumbled upon this reactor here. Looks really futuristic, and it's actually on a 10 by 10 centimeter scale, which doesn't sound that big, but compared to the scale that we work at right now, which is 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter usually, this is about 100 times the area of what we're currently working with. And so I found this group in Portugal that has been working on a project to develop something that looks like a commercial product that they can market to other laboratories, and that sort of gives you a more rigorous testing ground for your materials. And so I've started a collaboration with this group in Portugal because it seems like they're really leading the world in terms of these devices that they're producing. And so 2 weeks from now, I'll actually be in Porto, paying a visit to the laboratory I just showed you, the Mendes group. So I'm going to take some of our photoelectrode materials that I've been producing and others have been producing, and we're going to actually test them in these sort of rigorous setups that they've been building in their lab. I'll be working directly with the postdoc who designed the device, and we're going to actually sit down with the blueprints and make the changes that will make the devices more appropriate for what our group needs and what would essentially move it more toward a commercial scale or commercial grade reactor. So most of my time will be spent actually working with the designer and making the changes that we need. And then hopefully at the end of it, I'll be placing an order for our group's newest piece of equipment that will be used in a lot of our future studies in the group. So that's a big focus for what I'm doing. I also mentioned that we're moving from this sort of 1 square centimeter electrode scale to now 100 square centimeter electrode scale. So that involves a lot of scaling up of the actual materials that we use. And so I'll be working with the bismuth vanadate that I showed you earlier, and these are actually slides that I've produced. This is a material that I produced that looks following the procedure of the one that I showed you earlier. And so you can see the semiconductor there just deposited on the FTO. And some of my actual results here. Again, I mentioned earlier that we use this technique called linear sweep voltammetry to show how much current we're actually getting out of our material, how much energy we're actually storing through the photoelectrochemistry. And the black line here is actually showing the water oxidation reaction and the currents that we're getting due to that reaction, which is similar to the data that I showed you earlier. This red line is due to this oxidation of sulfite, which is a reaction that we study because it's more easily conducted. The water splitting reaction is a very tricky reaction, actually. It involves a lot of electron transfer, and some of the catalysts aren't as great for that reaction as we'd like them to be yet. So we study we study a more easily accomplished reaction first to sort of test how good our material is before we actually focus on the water splitting reaction. So the red trace here shows that I'm getting about 1.5 milliamps per square centimeter out of my material at the oxidation potential of water, that 1.23 number that keeps popping up. So if we convert that to the scale, it's under 1% efficiency, but still it's a start, and a lot of optimization needs to be done. And so for me, the next step are scaling up. Sorry, I'm skipping a little bit. So I mentioned to you that we work sort of on this scale here with these small area electrodes here. And my first step is going to be actually to scale it up to a little bit bigger size and study how the material synthesis works on a different scale, on a slightly larger scale. In order to improve some of the conducting properties of your semiconducting materials, a lot of times you do what's called doping, where you introduce other atoms into the matrix of your semiconductor material in order to sort of incite an extra electron into, in this case, add an extra electron into the conducting band and sort of make the conduction of your electrons more feasible. So I'll be moving from vanadium and substituting some of the vanadium atoms with molybdenum or tungsten atoms. So you can see that moving one column to the right in the periodic table, you'll add an extra electron into the mix and improve the conductivity of your material. And then we also need to think about the catalysts that we're using. I mentioned that sometimes the material itself isn't able to conduct the water splitting reaction perfectly, so we have to add catalysts on top of that in order to get the specificity to the type of reaction that we want to actually occur. So I'll be working on that next as well. And that's all I have for the science. I just want to thank some people. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate seeing some friendly faces out there. I want to thank Amanda, Courtney, and the MCR for putting on the series. It's really great. Get to hear what everybody else is working on. Got to thank the Reisner Group, especially my boss, my mentor, Hune, Jane, who is helping me out. We were working together on a lot of this stuff, and also Yishwan, who helped me sort of start to become a materials chemist. And I can't go without thanking the Winston Churchill Foundation of the United States, because a lot of us wouldn't be in this room without them. So I just want to say thanks again and open it up for questions. Yeah.
The fuel cells, the hydrogen fuel cell, how well can you scale that up to, like, can you make a power plant that's one giant fuel cell, or is it a series, or does each little thing have
a couple people in this room that can answer that better than me, but I think at this current time you would have multiple smaller fuel cells that would operate in series in order to produce the amount of energy that you need. You could definitely make something the size of an actual power plant that might be a bunch of fuel cells used individually, and then the power output from that could be on the power plant scale. I think that's definitely the way that it would go. Dave,
I was just going to follow up that. Well,
yeah.
Ask you then, for the hydrogen production, have they envisaged this being like really large tanks that are producing hydrogen, or how big are they going to?
No, so
because I imagine that they're going to make large tanks and sort of hook them up, but I wondered if they have an idea of the size.
So the scale, based on the materials and like the conductivity properties of these semiconductors we work with, the ideal final scale is probably closer to this 10 by 10 centimeter scale, where you'd have sort of tons of these panels, these 10 by 10 centimeter panels tied up in series in order to collect more solar area. But the actual individual devices themselves probably wouldn't go much bigger than this scale, because the larger you go, the more issues you run into with resistance losses.
I imagine that you're even losing some of the light that's just coming through the solution.
Yeah, you actually, that's a good point, because you actually want to have your two light absorbers as close together as each other as possible, because of the light scattering that occurs when it passes through one of the materials. So they're actually going to be very narrow things. I think this is
Okay.
actually quite an exaggeration. It'll probably only be a few centimeters thick, and then the surface area would be about 100 square centimeters,
Okay.
likely. Yes, Serge?
I was wondering if you could comment on, like, being able to use light-sensitive molecules from nature in these industrial applications, like
Yeah.
photosystem or redoxins. Or
Right. I didn't talk about this, but in our group, people actually work on natural enzymes, as I think you know. People in our group use photosystem 2, which is the light-absorbing structure from plants, and they actually use that enzyme complex in these artificial setups, the way that we use our semiconducting materials. So that's a really cool approach because the photosystem 2 complex acts as your light absorber and your catalyst all wrapped up into one. And then they hook that up to some sort of electrode setup, and using this natural thing, you can pass energy through a man-made circuit and actually produce your fuels that way.
and so, like, what's the efficiency for those?
Our group, I think, got around a 1% efficiency using enzymes as both the cathode and the anode, which, as you saw the efficiencies from some of the other inorganic materials, to get a 1% efficiency from this pseudo man-made, pseudo natural setup was pretty impressive, I thought. So they thought that was just sort of a fundamental science project to see if they could understand something about photosystem 2, but then it actually ended up working and sort of has them thinking about potential applications. Another way they're going on sort of the bio-inspired side of things is to use algae, because algae can actually like eat electrons off of an electrode and then make hydrogen gas out of it that way. Algae can do anything, just program their DNA, right? So that's another approach people take in our group. It's pretty sweet.
How would you convince an organic chemist to make more catalysts for you guys if there is another method which I think is more efficient in storing energy compared to your system? For example, silicon cells, right?
Yeah.
They're a bit more efficient, like 25-30%
Yeah.
efficient.
So like
And then-
photovoltaics, you're
yeah,
talking.
yeah. And then harnessing energy into batteries, for example, which are close to 100% efficiency. Am I right?
Okay.
And then-
I don't know if batteries are that close to 100% efficient.
Yeah, what he's talking about with that is just once you put it in, you're close to 100% efficiency with the
Okay.
battery, but it doesn't make anything, right? It's just holding it.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's transferring from the whatever you can get
Mhm.
from the photovoltaics to the battery.
But there is a method of transport and storing, just like the hydrogen, right?
Right.
Okay.
Um,
So your system is harnessing at 1%?
right now, yeah.
Okay. And then you need to store the hydrogen, and then when you use the hydrogen, you lose another.
Right. There's
uh,
inefficiencies
yeah.
involved with the fuel
The
cells. though.
fuel cell is not as efficient. So how would you convince me that
Yeah.
we should spend money into this area?
Right. So the big advantage I can see is that the hydrogen, I believe it to be way more transportable than a battery. In order to store the amount of energy in a battery that you can store in hydrogen fuel, you're going to have a huge mass that you need to carry around with it if it's a transportation application. So I think the hydrogen fuel is more flexible in that way. And hydrogen fuels can also then be, or the hydrogen you generate, as I showed, can also be used to generate carbon-based fuels, which function much more similarly to how we're used to using fuels. You can actually use these carbon-based fuels in combustion applications. So that's way further down the line. But I think you're getting at something in that there's a certain limiting efficiency to this technology that it's going to always have to fight against in order to sort of reach the same competitiveness. The real competitor for people who want to make solar fuels is that you can actually just take photovoltaics, the silicon cells that you're talking about, and you can do the whole water electrolysis reaction using the energy that you've captured, and you can do the water splitting reaction without having the actual light absorbers in your water solution. And that's a much harder question to fight against because you're actually simplifying the problem in that case. You're harvesting your energy in one place and you're
And more efficient.
making your fuel in another. But there's something elegant about this. It likely will never be the industrial solution. but there's a lot we can learn about how materials work and about these semiconductor materials that might be able to be used in other photoelectrochemical reactions. Maybe it's not energy storage, but maybe it's doing industrial reactions using light energy rather than using electricity.
And one more question
Yeah.
about the catalyst. Does it go off at some point? Because every catalyst.
Does it lose
Yeah,
its
yeah.
efficiency?
Does it lose
Yeah.
efficiency?
A lot of the catalysts that we work with do sort of tail off.
How many
on
cycles roughly?
cycles? I'm not sure, but it's usually on the time frame of hours at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not at the rigorous like industrial level that you need them at for sure. Yep.
Okay, so this is a question about how stuff works. Like, in your personal sense of the field, in like chemists working material systems and electrochemical cells, how interested do people seem to be in having explanations for why a certain catalytic material is better than another versus saying, oh, well, I can give some kind of explanation, but really what I want to do is just test out more materials and get better catalysts.
Yeah.
What's like the breakdown? I mean, this is a really qualitative question.
Yeah. I don't think I can throw a number on it, but there are very few people studying how catalysts actually work. Most people are just making catalysts and seeing if they work, and then that doesn't work. You try a different one and see the efficiency you get with that catalyst. That's my understanding of the field of catalysis in general. That's not to say that nobody cares about the mechanisms, but the people who care about the mechanisms generally aren't the same people who care about the application. Usually they have two very different mindsets. With our photosystem 2 studies, where they're actually trying to use the natural enzyme, there is a lot of work in our group specifically trying to understand the mechanism of how that natural enzyme does catalysis and how the electron transfer works in that system. So within our group specifically, the people making inorganic catalysts don't think much about mechanism at all, but people working with the natural ones are really interested in that because they're probing something that nature figured out millions of years ago, right? So that's more seductive for them. Yeah.
Speaking of how these catalysts work, has anybody been trying to use like computational techniques to understand what goes on in catalysts when it's photoexcited? And are these techniques good enough yet? I mean, you could run a reasonable level of DFT on molecules of that size. So
Yeah.
And that opens up a possibility to like high throughput searching of different types of catalysts.
Right. There are people doing exactly what you said. They're using DFT to calculate how the molecules interact with the light and conduct the actual catalysis. So there are those sort of fundamental studies being done on the computational side, and then I know especially at Stanford there's one collaboration where there's a computational group that works directly with an experimental group, and the experimental group will try to make the catalysts that the computational guys think will work. And then they'll see if they actually work as well as they're supposed to, and then they'll go back to the drawing board if it doesn't work. So there are people doing that specifically for the carbon dioxide reduction stuff. There's a lot of interest in that. Yep.
I have a lot of questions. Can you go to your linear soup voltammetry? Just
Any of them?
Any of them, yeah.
Let's go to mine.
Yeah.
That sounds fun, right?
So on the bottom, is that showing like an applied potential or what? Like, so is this a system with a battery and the photo anode? Is that?
Yeah. So I didn't explain this exact system. This is actually a 3-electrode system.
Okay.
I didn't want to go into all that, but so you have an electrode that's actually absorbing the light, the photoanode that I've made.
Yep.
I have a counter electrode that's conducting the opposite reaction, which is usually just platinum. And I also have a reference electrode that's maintaining a constant potential between my photoanode and my reference electrode.
Okay.
And so I'm applying a potential between my working photoanode and the reference electrode, and sort of studying how the current we get, how the energy storage we get changes with the amount of potential that we apply to the system. So in this case, yes, we're using electricity from the grid in order to make the reaction proceed more efficiently.
And this isn't like to simulate what it would be like if you were to get it from light. Then is that the idea? Like, does this system? I'm just trying to understand, does this system have any light going into it, or is this purely showing, like, what the response?
This has light in it, so you can see I've done the light chopping
Yeah,
in here, and so whenever the curve is on the baseline, there's no light showing on the sample.
Right.
And when I lift the light blocker from it, you see an immediate spike in the current. So there's light in this system, but this one single light absorber didn't provide enough energy to do the reaction on its own.
Okay.
And so we had to apply a potential.
And is that what that x-axis is showing? Is the applied potential that you put on it?
The x-axis is, yeah, exactly.
But wouldn't then at the end there, where you're applying like more than 1.23 volts?
Right, you're not actually storing any energy at that point. That's why we kind of shut off our experiments there, because it's meaningless to use these materials if you have to apply more potential than you could just do with non-light absorbing materials.
Right.
So as long as we're sort of more negative than that water oxidation potential, we're actually storing solar energy. We're getting some sort of electrical potential from the sun. That anywhere left of that 1.23 mark.
Yeah.
But as soon as we pass that, we don't even bother doing it.
So how do you pick which of those points is like, so all of those are kind of like solar energy augmented with a bit of like battery power or whatever. How do you pick which of those then are like to go off of your efficiency or go off of like your solar energy that you're storing?
Yeah, so this is just the setup where I'm only using one photo absorber, that one photoanode electrode.
Okay.
In order to make a full solar fuels device, I would likely need another photo-absorbing electrode on the other side. And that would be doing the opposite, the reduction reaction, where this is doing oxidation. And you'd actually have an overlap in where the curves meet. So you'd have, for the opposite electrode, you'd actually have a curve that looks much the same, but it'd be coming down like this.
Oh, right.
And so it would actually be improving its efficiency as you move toward a more negative potential, which happens with reduction reactions, right? And where the two curves overlap, that's going to be your maximum power point.
Okay, so that's what you
And so, say they overlapped here,
yeah.
I would take that current, and that would be the amount of energy that I'm storing in real time, where the two electrodes overlap, the two materials overlap. Yeah. So I can't really determine a solar energy efficiency from just what I've done.
Because you're looking at like a half cell basically.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah, that's what the 3 electrode setup does. It allows you to manipulate 1/2 of the reaction.
Okay. And then when you're making, now you're gonna make these tungsten and molybdenum doped bismuth vanidates. Are you actually doing that? Like, what? I was just curious about what you're gonna do to make those.
Yeah, I'll be doing that. It's essentially altering the precursor solutions that I use, and so I'll use a ratio of vanadium to bismuth, right now I'm using a 1-to-1 ratio of bismuth to vanadium. I'll substitute out some of the vanadium and use some percentage of molybdenum.
And you're making these from solutions?
The first step of the reaction is actually an electrode deposition, so that puts the bismuth precursor down on the slide. And then I'm using a solution that I drop cast containing vanadium, and then annealing them together to make the final product.
Okay.
Yeah. So the second solution that has the vanadium in it, I'll just alter the ratio of the chemicals I use. That's the approach. We'll see if it works. Yeah.
So we were on the topic a while ago, it seems, of using natural enzymes, natural materials, for these reactions. Do you know off the top of your head how efficient just plain photosynthesis is?
Yeah,
If
not
you just
very.
take that and burn it?
Yeah. So you mean
Like
how efficiently plants convert the sunlight into their. So plants convert energy from the sun into sugars that they use at about a 3% efficiency. It's not really that great. And then if you want to then convert that energy into something that we can use, you're just decreasing the efficiency on down from there.
Because it seems like one of the reasons you want to basically mimic this natural process is because you don't want sugars, you want hydrogen, you want something that's more easily stored and transported.
Yeah, we don't want the exact process because sugars don't help us much with our global energy issues. We need a usable fuel that fits our applications.